Welcome to Securing Digitalization, the Siemens cybersecurity podcast. Our hosts, Natalia Oropeza and Mirko Ross.
Welcome to Securing Digitalization. And in this episode, we'll talk about the importance of supply chain security. And it's a pleasure to have my fantastic co-host, the Chief Cybersecurity Officer of Siemens, Natalia Oropeza, with me.
And I am so happy to be again with you, Mirko Ross. So wonderful day today. We have a special guest, and this is Rafi Yahalom. And he's cybersecurity and data management researcher at the MIT.
That's great. Thanks very much, Natalia, for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me. This is a great pleasure to see you both again and to discuss a very, very interesting and timely topic. So just as a brief introduction, as Natalia mentioned, I'm a researcher at MIT. I've been involved in cybersecurity for over 30 years now. So starting before you were born, I believe, Natalia.
Yeah, wait.
And in being involved both from an academic perspective as well as a commercial and working with innovations and with real organization as well as academic research for many years. And this is an exciting time. These are exciting times because many of the directions that we saw coming many years ago and were designing solutions for are happening and are requiring interesting attentions now. So I really look forward to a great discussion.
Yeah. And to be honest, this topic is a dream topic for me as a cybersecurity researcher. Why? Because I think it's something we are watching the past years with more raising concerns. And now we have seen by the beginning of the year and end of last year that supply chain attacks are reality and that they are super powerful.
And you mentioned that this topic is becoming more and more important, and Rafi mentioned we are facing interesting times. And I want to tell you why this topic is becoming more and more important and more interesting. And this is because we know that companies are going through a process of digitalization. And of course, that includes not only we as companies, but of course our suppliers and our supply chain. So many of them are being digitalized. And digitalization, and we have spoken about this many times already, digitalization means use of software. It means more connectivity. And software has vulnerabilities per nature. I mean, there's nothing wrong about it. That's the way it is. And when we get, in addition, connectivity, of course, we expand the surface of attack. So what's happening is now we have to pay attention on who is in our supply chain and who is going through this transformation of digitalization. And in addition to that, we have to look at whether they are doing digitalization and cybersecurity at the same time. Cedric Nike mentioned several times, digitalization and cybersecurity are the two faces of the same coin. And that's true. They have to be together.
Can we just, for the people who are listening to us, some examples of supply chain attacks? What I have seen, for example, that one possible attack is that certain encryption libraries have been weakened in the past, and then other companies are building up their products on the certain encryption libraries, and then you see that this vulnerability is just then afterwards used from attackers who have already weakened their libraries in before, then to attack certain companies and products. But we have seen now as well like with SolarWinds Orion, that, for example, certain companies have been attacked where you know that they play an important role in the supply chain because their product is then as well used from others.
Yes, and to answer your question, I will say what type of attacks can we see there. And then I would love to hear Rafi talking about some examples or the most prominent examples that we have seen in the past. But what I want to say is the attacks are the same kind of attacks that you see in companies like Siemens. So, and they are risking the availability of information. So factory going down because of encryption of files due to a ransom attack. Integrity of the data being compromised because someone having access to scripts and programs or softwares, changing parameters. The confidentiality of the data getting lost. So with the so-called APT attack. So these are the type of attacks. Now, what you have to observe in this dimension of supply chain is that in this case, you are not getting directly attacked, but someone in the chain of your supplier is suffering this kind of attacks. And this is exactly where the danger resides, that you might not even be aware of the risk exposure you have if you don't do the task of identifying what risk you have in your supply chain. So I will stop here because I know Rafi is going to talk about a very good example, and I think I hope he can talk about that in full detail. The floor is yours.
Before going to some examples, and Mirko, you mentioned some great examples and we'll dive into some of them as in terms of what the lessons that can be learned. But I completely agree. I want to touch first of all on the fact that supply chain cybersecurity is not new. It has been happening, and it's growing. It's part of the whole cybersecurity evolution, which is based again on of course, as Natalia mentioned, on the notion of digitization in automation, and it's related to the overall issue of trust in general, and trust, and again, that's not new. So what is new is that we are seeing there is much greater awareness, much greater scale, much greater connectivity, and consequently, both the risk and both in terms of the likelihood and the impact are increasingly and are becoming, a really huge priority, which is beyond just the technical and cybersecurity expert, but as far as decision makers and society in general. And by the way, and again, without going to philosophical discussion, in my mind, when we talk about trust, it's not just about cybersecurity. When we look at some of the things that are happening in the world regarding trusted information and even social network and information flows, it's all related to the same type of issues to do with the notion of digitization and the new risks that introduces, as Natalia mentioned. And I think supply chain is not new. It's not inherently different than traditional cybersecurity, which is not through the supply chain, but it's just taking things to the extreme because, again, we always knew that cybersecurity, the attackers select the weakest link in a chain. Even when we talk about an attack within an organization and the lateral movements, from the initial part of the attack vector into the ultimate impact. With supply chain, we have that in a much greater scale across organization, finding the weak organization and escalating through the digital connections in a way which again is much more complex and hard to track. But also, we have much less control over our, outside our organizational boundaries about, the term assessing the level of risk and being able to manage and mitigate that.
Can I ask you something, Rafi? Because you said the weakest link isn't not only the weakest link, but maybe as well to find the most promising link for the attackers. And
just let me add something. And if in addition to that, the most promised link is as well the weakest one.
Completely agree. And jumping in and looking even at the recent examples like the SolarWinds case that you mentioned, which is just an example, and there are many others, including, again, in my mind, the most famous before SolarWinds supply chain is the NotPetya, a few years ago, which had tremendous impact, which is also an example of where a software attack traversed across different organizations and created, significant disruptions and impact. In the case of SolarWind, which is one of the cases with receive a lot of attention worldwide for good reason, because there are many lessons to be learned. And in my mind, the lesson is one of the important issues, and again, which is debatable, but I'll bring it up, is that SolarWind, in many respects, is a game changer in the industry. In other words, in my mind, although many of the techniques and the different steps are ones which are familiar to experts, and we've seen that before, there is a combination of factors here which, in my mind, the bottom line is that it shows that really new paradigms are required across the board to deal with some of these threats. I think SolarWind is a great example where it's not about a magic solution that can be solved here, or on a technical level or on a business level. It's a combination of different things which have to be done significantly different than what they've done up to now across the world. And it's not pointing the finger at anybody. And it doesn't matter if, like in SolarWind, there was a nation state behind it, or there are other forms of attacks for different motivations. I really believe that there is an opportunity and a need, but an opportunity for all of us, which is why it's an exciting time, to really change the paradigm and provide a much more comprehensive approach covering different aspects. And one of these aspects, as you mentioned, Mirko, if you look at, again, SolarWind as an example, it's not just about how secure they were, and obviously there were some gaps in the security at SolarWind, because we know that the perpetrators managed to change the code before it was signed and distributed to hundreds of thousands of customers around the world. So obviously there were gaps there, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what happened and what were the gaps. But the issue here, and that's one of our research direction at MIT, first of all, there is obviously a need to be in a better position in an automated, scalable way. How can organizations be able to assess each other in an automated, non-intrusive, scalable, continuous manner? It's a challenge. There are different approaches, but there is no magic solution. But to your point, it's not just about how secure they are. One of the things we're looking at is other features of each organization to determine how likely are they to be attacked. Why would an attacker choose? It wasn't a coincidence that SolarWind was chosen. They were not great in security. However, they are not particularly weak if you look at some of their other indicators. And we'll talk about some of the outside-in scores and what they can provide and what their limitations really are. But SolarWind has some interesting features, and we are trying to generalize it in terms of doing some research to look at the connectivity and other features of an organization which make it an attractive target from a supply chain perspective. Because that, just like with SolarWinds, not only you can get into many of their customers if you do the right thing, but you get into the customers in a very deep, because it's a software and it's a sort of network management sort of infrastructure level software. It provides access once you penetrate and once you infiltrate to the organization through that channel, through the vector. It provides really, unusually strong opportunities to take actions and bypass many of the controls in these victim downstream organizations. But let me stop there. But it's a lot of interesting lessons there, which we can come back to.
Is it like what you were explaining that we need to change as well the way on how we are looking on our supplier ecosystem, that I look as well, let's say, in the eyes of an attacker towards it, like what are the most promising suppliers in my ecosystem which I can attack to create the biggest impact?
There are some good practices that we apply in Siemens, for instance, obviously to clarify and identify where do we have the most risky suppliers, because they are increasing their digitalization, their automation. They are highly automated, highly digitalized. So they are, of course, focused for us from the risk perspective speaking. Then first. Second is make sure we have talked with them in regards on what are the requirements that we expect them to deploy so that they themselves are secure, right? Another good measure to apply is, of course, not only talk with the providers about the requirements, but prove that the providers have deployed those requirements and that they are more secure, or that they are secure. And another best practice is, of course, to cooperate and co-create with them and help them to develop themselves into the security that we need them to have.
I think there are interesting challenges, which I think Siemens and you, Natalia, and the Siemens team can continue to have a leadership position worldwide. I think the key moving forward, first of all, I think there is tremendous challenges, but as I mentioned earlier, I want to emphasize I'm very, very optimistic. Not overnight. We're not going to solve it overnight. There's no magic solution, but I'm very optimistic because I think in the next few years or in the near future, because of so much attention the whole world is now placing, I think this is going to be solved and we're going to be better off. And in my mind, again, the key that you mentioned there, Natalia, is the notion of risk. Thinking about it more maturely in terms of risk. We're not going to eliminate everything, but we need to treat it more. And we are currently missing as an industry, sufficient tools and sufficient models, and which is one of the focus that I'm working in team at MIT, is to put a better context into cybersecurity in the context of business decision and business relationships. Because that's really the key to really being able to answer the questions, are we doing enough relative to the risk, which we currently don't have a good way to answer in general, because the frameworks that we have, and whether it's the NIST framework or any ISO framework, any others, it's still very focused on particular controls and specific points, which are the foundation, very important, but it's not enough. And part of the secret magic here would be better sharing across different organizations, in a way which again balances the requirement, protect the confidentiality, of course, and the proprietary information, but sharing is the key, because not every organization needs to reinvent the wheel, and it's impossible.
I had a talk with Michael Decker, responsible for the supplier management cybersecurity at Siemens, and he has given me some insights in the role of cybersecurity in the supply chain and the supplier management of Siemens.
I mean, the cybersecurity is a new topic for the targets of procurement for a business when thinking about a supply chain. Like it has been, for instance, quality maybe 20 years ago. Or like ethical behavior, which we know as well, or to protect the environment. I mean, we see that in the relevance of topics, cybersecurity is growing steadily. Like IT is also more and more relevant for each and every business. And you could say these are two coins of the same metal. If you use IT, you have to take care about cybersecurity. And this is more or less embedded in every process, in every product, service we use and produce today.
Is it as well, Rafi, if you look at how we dealt with cybersecurity in the past, is of course we have the NIST and other frameworks, which are heavy frameworks, and they are good, but they are rather static in terms of how they are applied. For example, I apply all the processes as a company, and then I have my audits half a year, 1 year, and whatever, which is fine. Okay, you need that, no question, but it's a rather static model, because the question is, what is in between two audits? What's going on? What's changing? So do we need more dynamic models?
In my mind, it's a great point, Mirko. However, what is really missing and what needs to be happening, as you point out, is the continuous aspect in an automated way, as well as connecting the dots between the different controls, because they're not in isolation. If you say, well, I need two-factor authentication, of course you do need, for remote access, two-factor authentication in many environments. However, I love questions about how these things fit together. And that's where, and that's not as easy to come and say, okay, I tick that box and I tick that box, therefore I'm secure. If you look at some of the famous cases, including even SolarWinds we mentioned, but, the Capital One breach, and, these are highly regulated organizations which were victims. They were, to a large extent, really highly compliant with many of the frameworks, and they still managed to get there. So first of all, we know there is no guarantee for not being, there is no such thing as 100% being protected, for sure, in any domain. We're living in the real world. However, I think the key is how to be able to have them not only a continuous, to your point, but also a more, and actually, a lot of my focus is around the flow of data. In other words, a more business process oriented, in which the controls are part of the building blocks, but they have a relationship between them. And that even ties to the notion of defense in depth, which people like to use, which is important. But we haven't really, I think that again needs to be taken to the next level to determine what does it mean to have the proper, we know it, and Siemens again is a world leader in providing really highly reliable solutions and technologies and services. And we know how to deal really well, and Siemens is a leader in how to provide, robust relative to failures and to safety, right? We know how to do that really, really well. And Siemens, again, is a leader here. When it comes to cyber, the notion of independent failure modes is much more complex, and therefore we need to be able to determine much better what is the relationship between these different events in a way which we can reason in the same level that we are reasoning about safety, traditional safety, with respect to failures. What does it mean with respect to cyber events, in particular, again, in the context of supply chain, and about relationship between the different partners, risk convergence. Again, let me stop here, but I do want to also tie that down the road to the issue of outside-in scoring. Companies who provide outside-in score, which is, again, an interesting direction, but it's really not sufficient, and there are many holes there in terms. And I know people use that because, again, that's an example of an automated, scalable way to be able to assess from the outside. But again, we have some evidence in terms of research we've done about what is the shortcoming and how should that be complemented.
Tell me more about what kind of researches are you doing in the MIT that could support us with this topic of supply chain. So you mentioned this outside-in score. Can you tell me more about it?
Sure. Yeah. So again, MIT. Again, first of all, MIT, is for many years has been is and continuing to be a great friend and a great relationship with Siemens on multiple fronts. And there are a lot of different exciting research being done at MIT, around different aspects of technology, of course, but also cybersecurity, all the way from the very foundation, from the cryptography, an emerging direction in things like homomorphic encryption and cryptography. Multi-party computation, a lot of interesting, very impactful directions on the innovation and technology side. And there is also work in which I'm involved with, which is also aiming to have a much more data-driven work towards a risk management view of cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. So being able to, in a data-driven, using different advanced models and machine learning to really be able to determine what are the predictors of cyber risk, for example. And so as well as other research directions which are focusing more on the organizational aspects. And again, I'm affiliated with, although my background is computer science, at MIT I'm affiliated with the Sloan School of Management, and there is a whole program and a research initiative around things like cybersecurity culture in organization, cybersecurity governance, so a lot of different angles are being covered, which again bridge between the technology and innovation and the organizational /business governance aspects. So one of the interesting, most relevant research direction which I'm involved with, which I want to briefly talk about, which, by the way, I'm also in discussion with Michael and with Nino and Marcel about collaboration with Siemens and about Charter of Trust, and that's around providing additional context to make decisions and to prioritize. So there are a lot of different potential, both near term and long term. One of the things we've looked at, even before, and we started over a year ago, so well before things like SolarWind have erupted, is to collect data from a number of sources about supply chain in organizations and ask the question, to what extent, we knew that there were many cyber attacks which have some supply chain origin. So what we wanted to determine, in general, the goal of the research is to determine what are in an organization, what are the features of an organization which are predictors of a cyber incident. Okay, so the obvious one which everybody focuses on is how well are you protected? How well are you managing your cybersecurity, which can be done, traditionally is done with questionnaires or with assessments. And obviously that, again, very hard to do continuously in a scalable way, although there are directions to do that. What we have done is to look at an organization as complementary aspect of organizations, to look at their supply chain relationship. In other words, to look at who they are connected to, how many connections they have, what type of connections they have in a scalable way, and determine to what extent some of these features are really predictive of the likelihood of that organization to be attacked. Mm-hmm. Because again, that's something which is also not easy to obtain. What is for a target organization? What are their supply chain relationship? But there are ways to collect that again in a scalable way, and we're working on some of these. But what we've done empirically by looking at the data, we've seen that indeed, if you look at the organization and you look at their supply chain relationship automatically, and we collected data from thousands of organizations, and then did an analysis of, for the consequent period, which ones were actually breach, had a cyber incident or had a data breach, we saw that indeed the supply chain relationship of an organization, when you control for things like size, etc., is a very strong predictor. Different features of the supply chain, in particular things like how connected you are, but not just how connected you are, but where are you, tied to Natalia's earlier point, where are you in the graph of relationship with organizations? If you are more central, you are a more attractive target. Therefore, you're more likely to be breached, everything else being equal, because that's a great, and again, SolarWinds is a good example. And we actually looked at SolarWinds after the fact and we got some interesting insights which haven't been looked before, not only in terms of their number of customers, which is, again, a good indicator of them being an attractive target, but also they had an unusually, relative to their industry and to their size, SolarWinds, it turns out, had a very high number of suppliers themselves, much higher than average, which, again, people have not looked at, which is an interesting, because, again, in our research, we show the relationship between these connectivity features and the likelihood of being breached. In fact, we compare that, and that's to your point, Natalia, about the outside-in scores. The outside-in scores that people use without naming particular companies, but we all know, some of the leading ones, very interesting directions. However, nobody has really looked systematically at these scores coming in from some of these providers and how predictive they really are. They measure whatever they can from the outside in. And what we have done for the first time sort of systematically is look at for the same companies we looked at the supply chain, we looked at their cybersecurity scores from some of the leading vendors out there. And we compared again how predictive these were relative to other features and relative to the actual incidents. And what we saw that our connectivity features were much more, significantly more predictive than the cyber scores of these companies.
I do believe.
Is it like, Rafi, that I understand it? What you're doing is like you are modeling, let's say, a social graph of the company.
Exactly. As one of the things, and again, a social graph and looking at the relationship. And by the way, it's ongoing work. What we're aiming now to do is to add context, for example, to talk not just about the digital relationship between a company and its suppliers, but also, and again, that's something which to provide more information about the type of connection. In other words, what is the nature of the relationship? Is that a cloud provider? What type of relationship? Is that an application? Is that a device, a physical device, being supplied by one party to the other? In other words, the nature of the digital relationship is something which would add, again, additional context to having that analysis. But to your point, I think that's a great analogy. It's a social graph between companies and deriving insights from them.
Yeah, and then you have a semantic relationship, which is like, for example, is this a software as a service provider or a cloud provider? And by that, the graph will change. And then you see like what is the impact of a single company into the entire network because it's a hub, for example, for a certain topic.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, and that will help in the way that we evaluate our supply chain. And
we know there are a lot of brilliant minds worldwide out there on thinking about how to challenge it. And this is something which makes me really happy. And thanks for the insights. And by that, to everybody who is following our podcast, please give us a good rating, leave your comments. We are looking forward. And by that, Rafi, thank you very much. Natalia, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mirko, and thank you, Rafi. It was a pleasure.
I look forward to following up and to following up face-to-face and remotely.
Securing Digitalization, the Siemens Cybersecurity Podcast.